Welcome to S&C's podcast series, S&C Critical Insights. In this episode, leaders of S&C's tax practice, including tax co-heads Isaac Wheeler and Davis Wang, along with tax counsel Bella Schapiro and special counsel Aharon Friedman, continue their discussion on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. They dive into the policy debates driving the OBBBA changes to green energy and international tax, highlighting opportunities and challenges for taxpayers. They also set out areas that will be a priority for guidance by the Treasury Department and the IRS.
Let's talk a little bit about green energy and the IRA.
So I think we knew that there would be some rollback of the IRA. We knew that green energy wasn't particularly popular with some people in the administration and Congress, but I think we were surprised at how much of it was rolled back.
I think that's right. I think I would have said, and what I was hearing was, yes, rollback of the IRA is happening, but for some of the more established technologies like wind and solar, they have made their presence felt in a sufficient number of red states or red districts that they should be largely safe. And it's really the more nascent technology where there's less capital committed in respect to projects that should be worried about IRA rollback. And I think
It's almost like the opposite happened.
It is almost like the opposite happened. I think that I was surprised, and perhaps I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised by how much wind and solar took it on the chin. And so just the technicals for a second. So under the IRA, the PTC and the ITC for wind and solar would have continued for projects placed in service up to the later of 2034 or 2 years after the US meets certain greenhouse emissions standards. And so at the very least, you had until 2034 to place your project in service. The bill significantly accelerates that termination. As it stands, any project that is placed in service after 2027 that is relying on wind or solar is no longer eligible for ITCs or PTCs, with an exception for projects that begin construction on or before July 4th, 2026, so 1 year from the date of enactment. And I'll come back to start of construction in a second. Residential solar, there's a separate residential solar and wind credit under Section 25D. That is out altogether after 2025. And so really a severe disappointment for the wind and solar industries with respect to what they got from the bill. So let me ask Aharon before I get into the executive order and a few other things. Why was I so wrong? Did I just not read the room? Or was there something from a revenue perspective or something else that changed as part of the negotiations of the bill?
So I think there's an underlying current amongst Republicans as to the wind and solar subsidies needing to be done with. For decades, the wind and solar industries told the Republicans that they need temporary incentives in order to get them off the ground, but that at some point in time, they would be able to be sufficient on their own and compete in the marketplace. And this conversation has been going on for 20 years. And I think 10 years ago, Republicans started to ask more questions as well, when is this actually going to end? So I think they just thought it was a time to start cutting it off. I also think from a policy perspective, there have been more questions asked on the Republican side of the aisle with regard to how solar and wind, because they're temporary, wind isn't always blowing, the sun isn't always shining, how that affects the grid and how backup would have to work with regard to fossil fuels. There have also been questions asked about the environmental impacts of these huge solar and wind projects in the red districts. So yes, they result in jobs, but a lot of people just think they're an eyesore, a waste of space. And then also the fundamental question of whether or not the US should be trying to decrease its greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions in particular. I think there are many Republicans who think that that should just not be relevant. So I think all of that has a lot to say with why wind and solar were cut as much as they were, and they could have been cut even more than that, there's talk of another reconciliation bill in which priorities that certain people had might be addressed in the future. And I think there's more in the green energy space that could theoretically be cut. And I think the executive order that Isaac referenced, shed some light on what a lot of Republicans think about wind and solar.
Right. So the latest shoe to drop was actually on Monday. 2 days ago, President Trump signed an executive order declaring that the policy of the United States is to end the subsidies for wind and solar and mandating that the Treasury within 45 days look closely at the beginning of construction safe harbors to ensure that the hard lines that the bill draws with respect to when the subsidies should end are not manipulated by taxpayers trying to meet a beginning construction within the next year and then having that extend over a lengthy period of time and still take the position that you're eligible for the credit. I don't know how much time we have left. We can talk briefly about extenders. Bella, do you want to?
So a bunch of provisions from the TCJA of 2017 were set to expire at the end of 2025. And obviously a big priority for this bill was to extend those. We spoke about some of those throughout those provisions. And then some of the other ones was, for example, full expensing of domestic R&D expenses. So research and development expenses that were not entirely deductible are now permanently deductible under a new section 174A. There's been general bonus depreciation. So again, made permanent 100% bonus depreciation in election to fully depreciate immediately qualified property. There's also, along with that, a temporary bonus depreciation for non-residential real property. Aaron, you want to talk about 199 Cap A briefly?
Sure. So 199 Cap A has been a priority for Republicans when they lowered the corporate rate. They also wanted to adjust with regard to small businesses. The House bill would have actually increased the deduction to 23%, and the Senate bill keeps it at 20, makes relatively minor changes with regard to the income phase out.
So I'll just jump in and say this is a deduction for pass-through entities, right? To sort of equalize the rates with the lower corporate rate that was passed in TCJA. So they get 20% deduction of income.
So that largely stays as is with some minor adjustments to the income phase out with regard to the W-2 and investment requirements.
Let's quickly, because we're probably over time at this point, let's just talk about regulatory guidance for 1 second, because I know it's going to be a big part of what now tax policy moves towards is what do the regs look like that are interpreting the bill? So Bella, do you want to?
Yeah, so this bill has many dozens of calls for the Treasury to shall prescribe or as described or as defined. So there's over 60 calls for regulations by the Treasury for this bill. Some of it is to explain, to provide details or rules. Some of it is to make the mechanics work. And even beyond those that are specifically authorized in the text, there's likely other provisions that will require Treasury to provide guidance and explanations to taxpayers about how these provisions will work. So I think this will be really interesting. Firstly, it's a giant task for Treasury, as probably Aaron can speak to. And it'll be interesting to see what they prioritize, what comes out first, how various provisions are interpreted, particularly given the lack of legislative history. And there's also like an additional wrinkle that this is all in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision on Loper-Bright, where the Supreme Court essentially requires that authorizations for regulatory action be very specific. So the statute has to be very clear about what the Treasury is allowed to do, because otherwise the Treasury will be acting without authorization. So it's interesting to look at whether this bill has tried to be more specific in its authorizations for regulation. And it seems like there might be a little bit of a trend towards that after Loper-Bright. And also to see whether there will be challenges to these regulations under this new Loper-Bright standard. What do you say, Aaron?
Yeah, I think that it will be interesting to see, generally, even putting the bill aside, how Loper-Bright applies to tax guidance. Unlike other areas, taxpayers actually usually want guidance. There's some guidance they may disagree with. On the other hand, they want certainty from guidance. Sometimes the guidance is actually helpful to them compared to the statute. But under the bill, I think there are a couple of different sets of regs that Treasury will have its hands full with. On the other hand, it will not quite be the overwhelming task that it was in 2017 following passage of the TCJA. So as Isaac mentioned before, there are other components to the administration's regulatory or deregulatory agenda that we should expect to see in guidance coming from Treasury in the next couple of months and years.
I think that's a good place to stop. I want to thank everybody. Again, I'll reiterate the first point I made, which is if you have questions on the bill, if you have questions about how to amplify your voice in terms of the regulatory process or anything else, we are here and welcome all of those conversations. So please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you again.
Thank you for listening to S&C Critical Insights. For more information about our practice, please visit us on the web at www.solcrom.com.